Imagine this. A king wanted one woman so badly that he did not simply leave his wife. He challenged the Pope. He broke with Rome, and he changed the religion of an entire country. The king was Henry VIII. The woman was Anne Boleyn. She did not command armies. She did not conquer cities. She did not win a kingdom on a battlefield. But her rise pushed England toward one of the greatest religious breaks in its history. This was not just a love story. It was the story of how one relationship brought a kingdom face to face with Rome. In the 16th century, England belonged to Henry VIII. He was powerful. He was wealthy. He had armies, palaces, and a crown that almost no one dared to question. But there was one thing he still did not have: a son. And for a king in that world, this was not only a private sorrow, it was a political crisis. Without a male heir, the future of the throne could become uncertain. The kingdom could fall into court intrigue, succession struggles, and dangerous internal disorder. Henry's wife was Catherine of Aragon. She was a respected queen. She came from a powerful Spanish royal family, and she had stood beside Henry for many years. But Catherine had not given him the one thing he wanted most: a living son. Over time, Henry began to believe that his marriage had failed. Maybe he truly believed it, or maybe he needed to believe it, because by then his attention had already turned to another woman, Anne Boleyn. Anne was not an ordinary figure at court. She came from a noble family. She had spent time in European courts. She understood manners, languages, conversation, and influence. More importantly, she understood power. Anne attracted attention with her beauty, but beauty was not what made her dangerous. She was intelligent, she was patient, and she knew her own value. Henry wanted her, but Anne did not want to become just another hidden mistress of the king. She wanted something greater. She wanted to be queen. For Henry, that was not a simple desire, because Henry was already married, and to end that marriage, he needed permission from Rome. At that time, England was still part of the Catholic world. The authority of the Pope was one of the greatest religious powers in Europe. Even a king could not simply do whatever he wished. Henry asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. His argument was religious. Catherine had once been married to Henry's brother. Henry claimed that this made his own marriage to her unlawful before God. On that argument, he tried to build his future, but Rome refused. The Pope did not give Henry what he wanted. Years passed, letters were sent, lawyers argued, church officials were pressured, and the court waited, but the answer did not change. Rome said no, and in that moment, Henry's desire stopped being only personal. It became a direct conflict between the authority of a king and the authority of the Pope. Henry had to choose. Would he step back before Rome, or would he create his own path? He chose the second path. Henry broke England away from the authority of the Pope. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. At first, it may seem like this decision was made for one marriage, but its consequences reached far beyond that. England's religious future changed. The relationship between church and state was transformed. Monasteries were closed. Church lands were taken. The bond with Rome was weakened, and loyalty to the king became tied to loyalty to a new religious order. The desire to marry one woman helped change the religious direction of an entire country at last. Anne Boleyn became queen, but her rise did not bring peace. It created fear, anger, and hatred inside the court. Those loyal to Catherine refused to accept Anne. Many Catholics saw her as dangerous, and her enemies at court saw her as a threat to their own power. To some, Anne was intelligent, strong and open to reformist ideas, but to her enemies, she was the woman who had pulled the king away from Rome. Anne was no longer just a queen. She had become a symbol of England's changing destiny. Then the question that had haunted Henry for years returned again. Would Anne give him a son? The kingdom waited, the court waited, Henry waited. Anne gave birth to a child, but the child was not the son Henry wanted. It was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth. For Henry, this was a deep disappointment. He had challenged Rome, shaken the church, angered many of his people, and risked the stability of his kingdom, all in the hope of securing a male heir. But history saw something Henry could not see. That little girl would one day become one of the most famous rulers England had ever known, Elizabeth I. But for Anne, that future was still far away. Inside the court, her position began to weaken. In Henry's eyes, Anne was no longer what she had once been. The dream of a son had still not been fulfilled, and her enemies were waiting. Then the whispers began. Suspicion grew, accusations appeared. Anne was accused of betrayal. She was accused of adultery. She was even accused of plotting against the life of the king. Whether these accusations were true is still debated today. But in Henry's court, truth did not always stand above power. Anne Boleyn was arrested. She was put on trial, and in 1536 she was executed. The woman for whom a king had once challenged Rome now lost her life by that same king's command. Her rise had been fast, but her fall was even faster. Henry continued on. He married again. He searched again for an heir, and he made more decisions inside the dangerous world of court politics. But Anne Boleyn's mark did not disappear, because her story was not only the rise and fall of one woman. Her name remained tied to England's break with Rome. Her life became part of a much larger story, a story of religious change, court intrigue, fear over the throne, and the limitless ambition of royal power. Henry wanted a son, but Anne gave him a daughter, and that daughter would one day rule England, with a legacy greater than anything her father had imagined. That is why Anne Boleyn's story is not simply a love story. It is a story of power, a story of fear, a story of religion and politics colliding, and a story of how one relationship changed the fate of an entire country. In the end, Anne Boleyn was removed from the king's life, but she was never removed from history, because sometimes the thing that changes a throne is not a war. Sometimes the fate of a kingdom changes because of one decision made by a king for one woman.